What have been your biggest lessons you've learned since leaving social media and your massive platform behind?
I was originally going to delete it. And the reason that I didn't delete it is because I got like thousands of messages that were like, hey, can you just leave it up? I have stuff bookmarked, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, you know what? I spent 10 years putting art on this platform, like writing, sometimes 2, 3 times a day, which is crazy to think about. And I decided to keep it up. I'm happy that I decided to keep it up. I think we have to be mindful that sometimes the thing we think is true becomes untrue, or the thing we think we're learning becomes something else that we're learning, or the thing we thought we wanted isn't actually what we want. In exploring my relationship apart from it now, obviously that's created a lot of space in my life because I'm not writing on a social media platform or doing anything like that. I'm using other platforms. But I wondered, what was it specifically about Meta, about Instagram and Facebook, that was causing me so much strain? So I started to write about it, thinking, like, just journaling, like, oh, why do I feel anxious about this platform? And then I was like, oh, it's because I feel powerless in relationship to it. And what I mean by that is that I recognize that, my business was really built on it. So if I lost it, I wouldn't have a business. So there was a lot of fear, like, especially because we were in that time of very heightened censorship. And if you say the wrong thing, they'll just cancel your account, although that can still be true today. So it was like, no content is ever enough. The algorithm is always changing. Organic reach is no longer really that easy of a thing to get compared to formerly. And so I was just looking at all these different dynamics, and I started to see that we were not meant to be in a relationship with something 24 hours a day. And what I mean by that is, if you and I are hanging out and we're in public and we're sitting on a stage having this conversation at a conference, as soon as we get off that stage and we go to bed that night, we are not at social risk. This is assuming social media does not exist. But when clips of things and a profile of you representing you exists on the internet, you're at social risk 24 hours a day. So the nervous system doesn't know the difference between a social media platform and you legitimately in person, because our nervous system is ancient, right? It's like an inherited survival system in our bodies. So I learned a lot about that, about, of course I feel anxious. Of course I feel this way because I'm in relationship with an entity that constantly assessing my value. There's a non-human entity, an algorithm constantly saying, is this worth showing to people? Is this valuable? How do we determine value? And you're also at social risk from humans. And the difference is that if you and I are in a relationship and you experience feeling strained by me, not acknowledged, then our relationship would change based on that feedback. But when you give feedback to Meta, they don't change. There's no change. There's not even a customer service line. Like if you actually have a need. So the relationship to Instagram and Facebook is not relational. It's one way. And if you think about it, the algorithm is essentially saying what art is valuable and what art is not. And as creative people or artists, that can cause us to start to want to shape our art based on whether it will do well or not. And I think inherently in that, although I'm still exploring it, is an element of self-abandonment, is an element of abandoning our own souls in order to try to quote unquote do well. I just found myself having to tease out all these tentacles and layers and roots and hooks. It's very healthy when you don't know how to relate to something to stop relating to it so that you can figure out, can you? And so now I'm just like actually studying what are the layers that I would need to protect my own nervous system in relationship to social media, because I also see social media as probably, the version of cold calling of today. That it's not, I was talking to someone from Meta the other day and they said, it's really fascinating. So Meta still thinks it's a social media platform, but it's not. It's a business media platform. And I thought, that's so true. It really is. And the last thing I'll say is the big difference between YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and Facebook is that YouTube pays you for your content. It might be nominal, it might not be a large amount, depending on the person and their views. But at least they're saying, we value the money you make for us. The other platforms are not doing that. They're just exploiting and extracting from the creator. So the job of the creator is to then convert people to their products, which, of course, if you try to do that, the algorithm often downgrades the reach of the post.
And I think like along those same lines, like social media addiction is a thing. And I think that that's like the next big wave of mental health problems that you're going to see in the next few years is from that. I'm sure there's already centers and medical professionals that are, geared specifically for that. But, going back to what you said about your relationship to it and how, sometimes as creators, if you're trying to game the algorithm, at times you risk losing yourself in a way because now you're posting for the algorithm and you're not posting for your like purpose in life, right? Which is, it's hard. And so you talked about that for you and also, how that kind of impacted your business and stuff. But from a personal perspective, like your mental health, you and I have had some, conversations offline on the phone talking about like your relationship with it. And I think people will relate to like what you share as far as like, how did this all like impact your mental health? Because people might see you from the outside and see this guy who, somebody that a lot of people go to for things like relationships and self-help and working on themselves. And like, oh, this guy has over 1 million followers. Like, life must be good. But talk about like the dark side of all this for you mentally.
Yeah, I mean, I was feeling a really strained relationship with social media for probably 3 years before I left. I had a lot of anxiety, and I was not someone who had anxiety. That was not a way I would have referenced my life in any way. But it was, what you were saying, that it's so easy to get caught up in wanting to create the thing that you think will work. And how is that any different than being in relationship with people and being different than who you actually are in order to try to keep the peace? So it's like an extension of codependency. And I just found myself in that same juxtaposition of like, I want to create good things, but I also have a business and I got to pay people and I got to pay for my life. And I've got employees who have families. I was really holding all of that. And it was getting to be so much. I actually had a point where I was in a meeting and I was being told that I needed a bunch of things. I forget what they were asking for, but like more content, more blah, blah, blah. And I actually had this moment where I thought my brain was going to break. Like I thought I was just so overwhelmed. And I remember thinking like, if I keep going the way I'm going, my brain is going to fracture. I Googled when I got home, psychotic break versus nervous breakdown. And I was lucky I hadn't had either yet. But I really saw that as like a call. It was just like a call from my soul. And I think so many of us get that. We get sick, we have a breakdown, we go through a breakup, that was a rock bottom moment for me. And you know what? I listened. I let go of 2 people. I took a month off of social media, like paused any posting, didn't automate anything. But it actually took me about 2 years to actually say like, you know what? I actually need to be gone from here for a while and figure out how to not be dependent on it. And I mean, my mental health got better, much better, because I finally listened. That's the thing is like, even when someone says to me, I'm not sure if I should stay or go in a relationship. And I'm like, well, listen, the first thing is there's no such thing as the wrong decision. Like if you leave and you discover you wanted to be there, you only discover it by leaving. If you stay and you discover that you actually want to leave, you just gain more information. So I really needed to leave to be able to say, okay, there is value there, but I just want to make sure that if I'm in relationship with it, it's on my terms. And that's the thing is, in working with people a lot, I always say to them, like, if you can't say no to something or someone, so with substances, we understand that pretty easily. If you can't say no to alcohol or drugs, but if you can't say no to something or someone, then your yes is actually filled with small print. Your yes isn't truly real. It's not authentic. And I didn't have access to know with it because I was so dependent on the platform. But now I'm like built around it, built outside of it, diversified, which if you're a creator, a business, you must diversify the way that you bring people into your ecosystem. And the last thing I'll say to that, Doug, is that we are for sure in the midst of the mental health crisis that is created by many things, but perpetuated by social media, without a doubt. I actually think we're talking about users of social media, but I'm like, man, it's even more amplified if you're a business on social media. And your nervous system is going to be constantly dysregulated, and you're going to wonder why. It's so obvious. I mean, add to that blue light completely disrupts our dopamine pathways. And so you have all these confounding factors. It interrupts the production of melatonin. So smartphones on top of social media are just like a recipe for disaster unless we're building in mechanisms to protect ourselves and our biology, because love it or hate it, we are biological beings who have nervous systems, you know? So we have to take that into context. And this technology is new. It's so new. Think about how fast technology is changing versus how fast our biology changes. Our biology will have to adapt on some level, but I think a lot of people are going to continue to feel like they're going crazy. And I'm like, actually, you're having the exact appropriate response to having all your systems hijacked.
You talked about like it's similar to asking somebody if they should stay in an actual relationship. You know, it's like you have to weigh out the pros and cons, and then like, but whatever decision you're going to make, you're going to gain data, right? Either way. You know, from what I understand about you and your business, I think that without social media, you would still be able to pay your bills, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had to figure out how. And I had to bring my bills down because my overhead was pretty significant.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I'm bringing this up is you said you had this epiphany for the last like 3 years. Like it wasn't like you just had it for a day, it lingered for a week. You're like, you know what? Like I need to like get off social media for the sake of my own mental health. What took you so long? Like why did you wait 3 years?
Fear of irrelevancy, fear of not being able to figure out. I mean, I spent, at that point when I was starting that conversation, I spent 8 years building it. So there was a lot of my own identity intertwined in it. Yeah, there was that. There was also like, I don't know how to do it differently. So I'd say it was mainly fear though. It was fear and a lack of clarity. And also I really wanted to be in the conversations of what was going on in the world about like the way that we were manipulating psychology during COVID. And that was really like an important conversation I wanted to be part of, like seeing the impact all of the conversations about COVID that we're having on our relationships. And just that there was not really, I saw this culture shifting where we were just not open to dialogue anymore. It was just name calling and dividing everybody up.
But why I mean I understand the importance of like wanting to help other people and speaking out, but why were you willing to do that at the expense of your own mental health?
That's a good question. I think I had to. It was like, a lot of people didn't speak up about a lot of things because they were afraid of how it would impact their businesses or whatever. And I think in times like that, when the safety to have hard conversations and to talk about hard things is not there, the people who can handle the pushback have to weather it. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing that, because the reason that people don't speak up in subjects that are highly tense, and you could name that today, although it's gotten a little better, but that would be like things like COVID, things like vaccines, things like gender, things like politics. The reason that people don't speak up and share how they actually feel is because there's too much social risk. So the more other people speak up around them, the less perceived social risk there is. And that's why one person can change the world, because they have one conversation that leads to more people seeing that conversation. Which I'm not saying I'm the one person changing the world, but what I am saying is that I saw it as an ethical responsibility to have conversations about how shame and belonging were being used to influence behavior. And I think still are being used to influence behavior, and wanting to have that conversation out loud, if that makes sense.
And like, again, it seems like your work and what you do is just based out of love and wanting to help other people and being of service, which so it totally makes sense that you're like, you know what, I don't want to like leave my followers behind. But I'm curious, like, what do you think are some of the overlooked risks of being glued to your phone for long periods of time that the average person might not be aware of?
Well, one, I mean, just being glued to your phone all the time is completely disruptive to your ability to be in the present moment. You know, when's the last time you saw someone just like standing in line at Starbucks, you know, not looking at their phone? They're like, we're missing all these opportunities to engage with people in real time. And our bodies crave being in person with other human beings. You know, a lot of people will think like, oh man, when I finally achieve it, it'll be when I get a certain number of followers on social media. But you know, the most important question for predicting someone's mental health is, do you have someone to call at 2 a.m.? And so here we are like nurturing all these relationships online, but are we nurturing the relationships in our interpersonal life in person? You know, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote the book, The Anxious Generation, he said that we spend too much time overprotecting our children in the real world and underprotecting them in the online world. And I think that's so true. Like the cost to us is our health. Like the cost of us, I mean, you think of the impact of just being looking at a screen constantly, but also the heightened nervous system. You know, the other day I went and let my in-laws' horses out of their stall and put them in the pasture. I am not a cowboy. Do not purport to be a cowboy. That's probably obvious. And I have this idea that I'm going, so I've been told, I've been given specific instructions. Mark, put the horses in the pasture and then put the food out and feed them separately. I'm like, you know what? I've done this for 5 days. I'm going to hack this. I'm going to put the food in the pasture and then go get the horses. Well, as I do that, Doug, I put the food out and I'm proud of myself. I think I've figured this out. I look over at the stalls and they're running in circles, the two horses. And I'm like, first off, I've never seen them this excited, and I do not have the skill set to manage horses this excited. So I go over, I put the nicer one in, bring him to the pasture. He goes, eats. I take the second one who's like, she's going, and she's doing stuff that I'm like, okay, I don't have the skill set for this. I don't have a cowboy hat, you know, like I'm out of my league here. So I grab the horse, I open the stall. She starts to run as I'm holding her harness, and she hits the end of the rope and doesn't pull me, but I'm like freaking out. We're only like 60 feet from the entrance. But as I like hold it, which I'm sure if you're a horse person, you'd just be like, pull on it and say like, shut up, I got you. You know, you'd say something dominant. The horse does a jump rear kick. And I'm like, hell. So I take the horse into the pasture. She goes, eats. I get it off. I get home and I'm thinking to myself, holy shit, I'm so dysregulated still. So I'm like, I'm going to check my glucose. I take my glucose. It's an hour after and it's still 120. So that means my body, because it's scared in that moment, dumped a bunch of sugar in my blood and said, we need to either get out of here or fight or flight or freeze, right? So it goes into that response. And then it made me think about a time when I got an email and I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor. Have you ever worn one of those?
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. So I got this email and my blood sugar went up to like 140. And I was fasting at the time. And I started to think to myself, Doug, that the body doesn't know the difference between a potentially life-threatening event and an email. It doesn't know the difference between a troll on the internet or a comment section that feels scary or a stranger DMing you. It doesn't know the difference between that and a bear. And so I think about how much insulin resistance is likely also being created through this. How is it impacting the foods that we eat? How is it impacting our relationships? I think of the inflammatory cost of being on our phones all the time and our brains being hijacked. And just like falling, have you ever gone to use your phone to do something and all of a sudden you're like 30 minutes in and you've been watching videos? You have a cat now, so you're probably watching cat videos. Like it's easy to get lost.
The cat's got an Instagram account.
That's it. But it's like, you know what I'm saying? It's like easy to get lost on these things.
Taking a step back, how do you see social media impacting, intimate relationships, like the bread and butter of your content?
Well, I think it's impacting our nervous systems and our ability to regulate. That's the big thing. I think blue light is also disrupting us with that from our smartphones and our screens. I see it impacting because we're often not present with each other. We're like trading moments together to be searching feeds and looking at, houses and Pinterest. And again, there's no problem with any of these things. It's just because they're being done in such high amounts that they're actually like pulling us away from interconnectivity. I mean, I think you also have that it's easy to get lost in a fantasy world of what's going on online. It's easy to get captured by things like pornography. It's easy to, like all of these different ways that we disconnect from true vulnerability, from true presence. Now, with that said, obviously there's the ability to learn a lot from social media, and that's been like I met my wife on Instagram, so I don't hate the platform. It was just like more starting to see that Instagram changed a lot over time. It went from a follower forward platform to a content forward platform, which means now the average person that sees a video that they're fed doesn't actually doesn't engage in following the person anymore because they know the algorithm is just going to feed them what they desire. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think when it becomes, I think in many ways it becomes a harmless distraction. Like people will be out and it's like, well, what? I'm just like scrolling on social media. Like, how is that going to impact my relationship? And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it from time to time. Like if you're just watching a show and you're kind of like, just mindless, I think it happens. I do it. I'm not perfect, right? I think if it happens a lot and you don't have, scheduled intimate time together and that becomes like your norm, then yeah, like you're going to be used to not being present with each other, which will cause a variety of issues down the road. Getting back to your story with this, which I think is really empowering for people because I saw it unfold. You talked to me about it before you were doing it. And then I saw like the messages of people that followed you. I had friends that followed you that were like, oh my God, did you hear what Mark's doing? I'm so inspired. You mentioned you got a lot of messages to keep the content up. Makes sense. Your content's always been great. What were some of the common messages from the perspective of the fear of leaving social media, like your journey of that? Because I know you got a lot of messages about that stuff too.
Yeah, I got a lot of, it's ironic because you would get like people who would say just stay on essentially because they needed you. Like they need your messages. They need, the irony too is that my work was really born from the place of wanting to help people. And then I ended up, which is totally normal, is like I ended up really abandoning myself in service of helping people, which again is like really at the origins of this is codependency. It's like what made me so good at navigating relationships and human behavior was because I was someone who as a kid people came to for support. And, I wanted to manage the emotions in my household to create a sense of psychological safety. And so, yeah, I got messages from people that were all the range of the gamut that I can't believe you're leaving to go to YouTube, which I was like, so you're making the decision based on money. And I'm like, this is first off the worst business decision ever, but it's a great personal decision. So I got lots of messages. At that time too, you're just dealing with people on the internet are not real. They don't get immediate social feedback. I think is it Mike Tyson who said the problem is now you could say something and not get punched in the face. And I think there's a lot of that on social media is just like people projecting all their, and I didn't know how to depersonalize that. And that's something I had to learn how to understand and build.
What's your advice to somebody who isn't in the content creation space like you, where there's so much in your face? There's the desire to do more and more and more and like track the algorithm and track views and track who's sharing your stuff, track who's commenting, track, what's getting, negative remarks, what's getting positive remarks. But somebody just feels like they're just like overly consumed and trapped by social media, but they just don't really know if it's the fact that it's them or that they are just spending too much time on their phone. Like, how does the average person know if they have an unhealthy relationship with social media?
Well, one, you get your screen report every week, and it tells you that you could have a second job based on the amount of social media you use. I mean, all joking aside, I mean, that is true, how much screen time you have, but it's anxiety. I see it a lot when people have a lot of anxiety, have depression, but especially anxiety. Anxiety is an emotion that is definitely a very good symptom, especially if you're using, you asked that question about couples, like how much easier is it for me to just numb out and doom scroll instead of have a hard conversation? How much easier. And you got to remember that these algorithms are specifically designed to keep you on there. They're specifically designed to actually like keep you on the phone so that you stay on there, because they make money the longer you stay on there. So if you are addicted to social media, that's exactly how it's designed. So you're actually doing exactly what it's designed to do to you. And I promise you, there are thousands and thousands of behavioral scientists whose whole job is to figure out how to steal every second of your life. And so my first is, do you have anxiety? Do you feel, even if you're thinking, maybe I have some tension or an unhealthy relationship with social media, I would say you likely do then, because that point of inquiry is actually really important, that you're even asking it. It's like if you think, oh, I'm not sure that my relationship to alcohol is good. You're not asking that question because you don't think that's true. You're asking that question because you're trying to figure out how to heal a relationship with something. So the first, following the anxiety, following the feeling, and then I would say quit for 3 months. Quit for 3 months. Just take a break for 3 months. And I promise you, so much stuff will come up. All the stuff that social media is numbing you from. I once did this workshop where a lady was talking about how sober she got. She got sober from alcohol. She got sober from weed. And she asked the person, like, what else can I do? And the teacher, her name's Ganga Ji, she said, get sober from everything that disconnects you from who you are. And I think that's such great advice. And social media is just another socially acceptable, if not acceptable, actually encouraged form of addiction.
Like, what have been some of the things that you've learned about yourself, like personally? Like this, you seem like somebody who just done a lot of work on yourself, very introspective. Like, what have been some of the painful realizations that Mark has had with your relationship to yourself and social media?
Definitely that I was so addicted to it that my identity got trapped in it. My sister said to me years ago that when you create anything useful to the world, a third of people will love you, a third of people will hate you, and a third of people will be indifferent. And I always thought to myself, like, do we have to have the hate? Like, as someone who was more of a people pleaser and wanting to keep cohesion, that was really hard for me to hear. But what I've had to learn that has been hard is that when you are holding a rudder of integrity or truth or whatever is true for you, and you're disrupting a system and your role in that system, and that could be the role I had as a teacher in the space of relationship. And also, talking about relationships is easy. You're not highly controversial. But as soon as you get into any other realms of conversation and you face the pushback, yeah, I've had to learn a lot about myself. I also had to learn that, like, in my desire to resolve division and actually have hard conversations, I think sometimes I was myself dysregulated and creating division just through the ways I was delivering stuff. And yeah.
Well, and the ironic thing too, to me, is, you staying in the game for, years longer than you probably should have, in an attempt to help bring people together and solve, in your opinion, this crisis of division. Yet you were so divided in yourself. Do I stay or do I go? Am I putting out the right message? Am I doing it for the algorithm, or am I doing it for, the content that I like? So how did you battle that, like, as somebody that wanted to bring people together, yet you were so divided within yourself? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, it's such a great observation and point. Yeah, I felt really split. And, there's that idea that when you experience trauma, you split, like your authentic self splits from, in order to keep you safe. And so I found myself like wanting to keep the peace, but also wanting to have hard conversations. And I created a separate Instagram account. And, recently I was talking to a person on my team, And I was having this realization, which is very simple, but and so it might sound simple, but for me, it was a long, arduous process of figuring out, which answer or gets to the point you're making, which is I realized that Create the Love as a mission and an experience needed to become separate from me. I was trying to figure out, how do I be all of it? How do I have these conversations about politics and health and relationships and like stay on this clean mission of Create the Love? You couldn't. It was impossible. And so it was like I was stuck in essentially like a functional freeze state. I felt confused. I was never taking a step forward. And part of the maturation process, I was saying earlier that I started Create the Love from a place of like wanting to help people. And at some point, it had to be differentiated and become its own thing. That is a mission that people contribute to. That's not me. And so the maturation and initiation process of actually like separating it from me, so it's separate and I am me. So yeah, I hear you on that. That split has felt really hard. And that's why I needed to leave social media, was to help resolve that, to say, okay, I got to regroup. And if I come back, what's it going to look like?
This episode is brought to you by MitoLux. Let's face it, the importance of getting adequate sunlight has become quite popular lately, mainly for optimizing things like your circadian rhythm and vitamin D levels. With the rise of technology, people are spending way too much time indoors with artificial light. And when you're spending so much time indoors, it's much harder to get adequate amounts of vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiency can cause a variety of health issues, including depression and bone and muscle weakness. Many people have a hard time taking supplements, and if you are one of those people, then I highly recommend checking out MitoLux's Sun Lamp. Using it for just 5 minutes per day can help you give the benefits of natural sunlight. The lamp has UVB, red light, and infrared lights to make sure you cover all your bases. MitoLux has created a special code for my listeners, and if you use the code Doug at checkout, you get 10% off. So go to www.mitolux.com and use the code Doug at checkout for 10% off. Now back to the show. Thanks for sharing all that, man. I mean, I know it's not easy to talk about this stuff. I want to keep going with this. How did you begin to like reinvent your identity? Like, what was that process like?
You know that story about when Michelangelo gets asked about how he carved David, and he said, I just removed everything that wasn't him. And I think about that a lot with the structure of like, how did I get more in touch with my authentic self? Well, I had to remove the things that were causing tension in my life, like social media, so I could figure out who I was outside of the relationship to those things. And it was through deep introspection. I was realizing that I was out of integrity in a lot of areas of my life. And like, what did I truly value? How did I really want to show up to life? Was I having all the hard conversations I desired? Were the people I needed to repair with? And so, yeah, the journey is, you realize how much humility is required in order to grow in any relationship. And I also think a lot about the accountability of being someone who speaks out about things, teaches on things, and the accountability being that, for me at least, this is true, that you can never ask anyone to be what you're not. And, you know, if you're going to be in relationship to people, like the book my wife and I wrote, Liberated Love, the whole premise of it is like truth ahead of everything, like truth ahead of everything. And so it's like, okay, where am I not truthful? Where am I not 100% honest in myself? And how do I create the circumstances and relationships in my life, including the business that I create, so that they're actually formed around who I am authentically? And I think we often confuse on social media that authenticity means giving zero fucks about how you do something. But, you know, it's like, you still want to have strategy to how you do things, you know, because good strategy is actually very important.
What's been the most humbling thing for you through all this?
That's a good question.
And the reason I share that is you talked about, like, you felt like you were living out of integrity, right? Like, you preach on social media, like you've built a platform of over 1 million people where you're so known for helping people cultivate healthy relationships with themselves and others. And yet you had a massive unhealthy relationship with social media and an unhealthy relationship with yourself. Like, how humbling was it to come to that realization?
Yeah, I think it was that. Yeah, that's such a good question. When I think about what was the most humbling part of it, Yeah, that I was out of integrity with that platform, with the way I was using it. That's a great observation of it, or framing of it. It was that here I was using this platform as a way of delivering a message that was important to me, yet I wasn't feeling great about using the platform, which is a really hard oppositional force, right? Because you're like both knowing this is the vehicle that I use, yet I don't like the vehicle I'm using. Which I heard a guy the other day say that if you think social media is toxic, then it's about your relationship to social media. And I was like, that it's about you. And I was like, yeah, that I'm the one who has the lack of ability to manage my relationship with this thing. And then I'm demonizing the thing. It's like alcohol. I don't drink. And it would be like saying that no one should ever drink because I don't drink. Like no one should use social media because I don't. And it's like, no, there's nuance here, and I just didn't know how to dance in the nuance.
Yeah, there's definitely nuance, because I think social media is a great tool, right?
It's incredible.
It's amazing what it
for change.
Yeah, what it does, and we would be where we are today without social media, right? So I think it's important to recognize that. I think the part for me that kind of sticks out, I think what you said that a minute ago, that what somebody had told you was like, it's about your relationship with it. I think it's spot on with the caveat, right? It's like, I don't think you expected to get where you are today and build the platform that you have. I mean, that said, somebody who has low self-esteem and low self-worth, or has an addictive personality, or somebody that creates a business that revolves around likes and comments, etc., like it's definitely an easy mechanism to become addicted, and to use that as a form of validation that will completely hijack your dopamine system and completely, like, screw up your brain, right, if you're not careful. And I just think it's also, like you said, important not to point blame to the platform itself, to think, because it's like, like the point you made, like there's plenty of people that drink alcohol socially and are perfectly fine. But then there's the people that like can't. They're like, all right, if I have a beer, like I'm in handcuffs, right?
I'm having 20. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to me, man, that like you built this platform and created this account that was all about like relationships. And then behind the scenes, you had this unhealthy relationship with yourself and social media. And then you exit, and then you have this epiphany. Like how, like who is Mark now, like without Create the Love? Like what has been, like, I'm sure you're somebody who journals a lot, or somebody who's like expressed yourself in some way. Like what has been like some of the values and beliefs that you found out about yourself that you didn't when you were hiding behind this identity on social media?
Well, I think I've always been really truthful about what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing. Like, if anything, I'd say that my audience has always been walked through the tensions I'm walking through. Like my podcast, I've always been very transparent about the things I'm struggling with. And, in a lot of ways, I think I like evolve out loud. That's really where my teachings come from. So, I wasn't sharing as much my tensions with social media, but I was constantly sharing the tensions I was experiencing. And that social media is like, it's not always the real world, I had a son 20 months ago. So that really changed a lot of things for me, because I thought, okay, well, I'm going to tell my son about how to be a good man and how to live a good life and what it means to be a man of integrity. And is what I tell my son matching what I'm doing and who I'm being? So that became this whole new layer of like, what did his father stand for? What does his father stand for? Who was his father? And that actually has been like just a guiding accountability of staying in integrity with the message I send and the, quote unquote legacy I leave with him, and maybe just in general. And I really thought about that. Like, what did I stand for? Did I stand for love, or did I stand for fear? And so I think a lot of the learnings that I've had of like what I value integrity and truth. Like those are the number one things. Also, I value freedom and liberation. I mean, our book's called Liberated Love. And really at the premise and core of all my work is to liberate people from the patterns that are holding them back. And I found myself deeply in one, like deeply in a pattern that it felt like a final I don't want to say final because then the universe is going to give me more, but it felt like a completion of that initiation of like, who am I separate from what I created in the world, separate from my mission, that I needed to differentiate those things. I think it's so easy for us to have ego and identity wrap up in success and to stay in safe spaces of conversation instead of actually like following the call of our hearts. I feel like I've been afraid about that for a little while of like, what am I being called to talk more about, which is more about things like politics, things like health, things like, so the last year and a half, I've really dove much deeper into my own. I've always been intrigued with health. I used to work in pharma for years, so ages ago. But which I wouldn't call that health, but that's an avenue of health. But I've always been into fitness, and I played high level soccer. So for me, it was like, okay, I've got to dive deep back into that. And what I really realized in diving deep into that, going through the tensions with social media, is that all of it is connected. All of it is connected. Do you have access to discernment? Do you have access to choice? And, there's a famous saying from Dr. Harriet Lerner where she says that if you're not free to leave a relationship, you won't feel free to be yourself in a relationship. And so I think all of that I think just the values that I've oriented around just became a lot more ingrained, and I saw a lot more of my blind spots about where I could lose myself again.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to me where like social media has like created this form of like social currency that really didn't exist, right? Where now publicly you can see how many people like somebody, how many people follow somebody, like how popular is somebody, how much is somebody engaging with somebody, like, and I think to certain people like that can really play a role like on their own identity, right? And comparison and stuff. I personally, like, I've never, I mean, as you know, my story, I mean, I'm a recovering like drug addict. I've never been like addicted personally to social media. I will say I do pay attention just for the sake of like brand deals, or like, hey, like how many impressions a month is your Instagram getting? How many impressions a month is your podcast? So when views or engagement does sink, I mean, it does create a certain level of stress. It's like, oh, like now I gotta like recalibrate my rates and stuff like that. But I guess I've just been really fortunate that I didn't build this massive, business starting on social media like you did. Like I was a personal trainer for a long time, and then that evolved into other avenues of financial stuff and building a brand through that. So I was fortunate with that. But I do think that, it's a very slippery slope for a lot of people if they're not like careful. What have you like? Is it, what did you like? I think of it like, you openly admitted that you were addicted to social media and addicted to the grind and stuff. And I relate that to like drugs, right? So like, did you ever have like cravings to go back and like post and get some, I mean, I don't know if I would call it validation, but to like engage with your audience or whatever? And if so, like, how would you like self-regulate?
Yeah, now, because I still have DMs that I get and like messages. So at first I wasn't managing any of that, but then I had my producer for my podcast started a Mark Groves podcast Instagram, and so was managing that. And so I would see it every once in a while, like she would send me things that were required, or I'd want her to put stuff in stories about my opinions about something. And so, yeah, I never craved going back. Like I didn't want to go back and be like, oh, I need to post. Like but I do have to say that from a healthy way, now that I was away from it for so long, I was like, damn, I really want to be in the midst of all these conversations. Like there's really good conversations I want to be having. And I have a lot of thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and I'm sharing them on YouTube. But Instagram, I have access to so many more people. So, there was a desire to want to get back into that and have beautiful conversations and teachings and all that and learnings. So yeah, I definitely have had, and that's what I've been exploring lately. I was just journaling and mapping out how would I come back and what would I need to have as tools in order to be able to do that from a healthy and regulated place. And I think I've figured that out. I just have to implement it. And I do actually want to run, because I get a lot of those questions from people like, I have a lot of tension in social media. Like, I don't want to, and I have a business, how do I? And I'm like, there's a way. There's definitely a way. And so I've been really learning a lot about that. And I think part of my guidance in January will be working with entrepreneurs and creators on how to actually get their mental health back, but still maintain a relationship to social media platforms.
Knowing what you know now about the platforms, like what's your advice to somebody to, keep the relationship with it constructive and fun?
Well, it might not always be fun. I'll qualify that because there's a lot of crazy people on the internet. I think that the relationship to it, I joke often that for every wound that you have, there's a troll farm designed specifically to wound you. So like the things that are unresolved relationally and in your childhood, etc., will come up for you in your relationship to social media. They will come up in your relationship to people on social media. I mean, I think just being aware of that, being aware that if you get triggered on social media and you find yourself often dysregulated, often activated, frantic, or like needing to reply to something or engage in the comments, that's a great sign that you need to take a break and take a step back and really assess your relationship to it. I'd say I think automating your posts, programming them is very good for people so that they're not on doing it every day. Do you automate yours or do you post?
Do I automate my posting? I mean, it's very, I mean, I don't want to say random. I mean, I used to have like a schedule back in the day, but no, I mean, I've focused so much more on YouTube and the podcast. Yeah, that's where I put most of my energy. I mean, I'll still post just to keep up with the audience that I built over the years, but I do notice that like if I don't post for like a few days, like I'm down in the algorithm. You know what I mean?
Well, that's the thing. They recommend at least once a day and da 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 da. So you have to be like constantly coming up with it. I do have to say, if I was to start all over again, I would start on YouTube.
Really?
I would put all my energy into YouTube.
Yeah, that's where it's at, man.
I really think so. I think the other platforms they're exploitive and extractive, and they don't care about creators. YouTube, it's not like YouTube is the like heaven or glory land of social media, but it is in terms of like at least the platform pays you. And I think that is actually from a relationship lens. That means it has reciprocity. That means when you create something for YouTube and you get compensated for it, even if it's $20 or $10 when you're first starting out, $5, 50 cents, at least you're thinking like, okay, the relationship's here. Like it's happening.
I love YouTube.
I think YouTube's great. And also I think that because it's longer form, I actually really like that. I think it's really important that we all get to learn how to have complex conversations. And I think people are tired of two things. They're tired of really kitschy short form content that is filled with hooks. And they're also tired of false virtue signaling. Like both of those things, the virtue signaling thing has been so extracted and just like used as a way of psychological manipulation that people are tired of it. So they're craving, and you're seeing this in the trends on YouTube. People are craving real blogging again, like video blogging, where it's not like a curated, amazing set. It's like someone walking with a camera talking.
Anything else you'd like to add that you think people would find valuable, or if somebody is like kind of questioning their relationship with social media, like anything you'd like to share that may, give some people, some hope and just some more feedback?
Well, I think it's like any relationship, when people would say, oh, like if someone has a good relationship, they just got lucky or they grew up in a good family, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, everyone can learn the skills to create epic relationships, just like everyone, I avoided relationships for a long time in my late 20s. I only participated in more short ones, short form content relationships. And that was because I didn't know how to relate. I was afraid that if I went deeper, I would get hurt again. And I didn't understand that. And so I had to learn a skill set to walk through, because the thing is that where love lives, also your greatest pains live. So if you want to walk towards love, you have to walk towards your pain. I say all this because from a social media lens too, I thought I had to get rid of it, but really what I had to do was learn how to relate to it. And I had to walk towards the ways in which I lost myself and my identity, and I sourced worth and value from it. I had to walk towards those things to learn. how to actually take charge of how I feel about me. And so if you're feeling like, oh, I got to get rid of it or I got to delete it, I know that there's another way. And that way is actually choosing your relationship with it. And that's true of anything in your life. And so if social media is bringing you anxiety, anxiety is a really good sign that you don't have access to choice. That's always, because anxiety is perceived as future oriented. So it's because we don't have access to self-expression in some way. And so we have to actually learn how to get access to our voice, because our voice is what steers our life. And if we don't have access to a no, then we can't steer our life, which means our life will go the direction of our people pleasing, our shape shifting, which again, social media is just going to amplify.
Well, Mark, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming back on the pod. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. Thanks for all the great questions.
You got it.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.